The morning sun cast long shadows across the military base as Captain Marcus Reed strode through the corridors with his usual confident swagger. His boots echoed against the polished floors, each step a testament to his 15 years of distinguished service. At 35, he was one of the youngest captains in the naval fleet, known for his sharp tactical mind and unwavering dedication to military protocol. Marcus had built his reputation on being tough, demanding, and absolutely intolerant of what he perceived as weakness or insubordination. His crew respected him, though many also feared his quick temper and rigid adherence to the chain of command. He believed that discipline was the backbone of any successful military operation, and he enforced it without exception. The base was buzzing with unusual activity that morning. Word had spread that a new admiral would be arriving sometime during the week, though nobody seemed to know exactly when or who it would be. Marcus had heard rumors that this particular admiral was some kind of rising star in the Navy, someone who had earned rapid promotions through a combination of brilliant strategy and unconventional methods. As he made his way to the communications center, Marcus noticed a young woman in civilian clothes standing near the main entrance, looking somewhat lost. She appeared to be in her early 30s, with shoulder-length auburn hair and an athletic build. What caught his attention immediately was her casual attire: jeans, a simple white blouse, and sneakers. Civilians weren't supposed to be wandering around the base unescorted, especially not in restricted areas. The woman was holding a tablet and seemed to be studying a map of the facility. She looked up as Marcus approached, and he noticed she had striking green eyes and a confident bearing that seemed at odds with her apparent confusion about her location. "Excuse me," Marcus called out, his voice carrying the authoritative tone he used when addressing subordinates or civilians. "This is a restricted military facility. You shouldn't be here without proper clearance and an escort." The woman looked up from her tablet, meeting his gaze directly. There was something in her eyes that Marcus couldn't quite place. Not fear or intimidation, as he might have expected from a civilian caught in a restricted area, but rather a calm assessment. "I'm looking for the main administrative building," she said simply, her voice steady and confident. "I seem to have taken a wrong turn somewhere." Marcus felt a flash of irritation. Not only was this woman in a restricted area, but she seemed completely unconcerned about the seriousness of the situation. Her casual attitude struck him as disrespectful to the military environment and the security protocols that were in place for good reason. "Ma'am, I need to see your visitor's pass and identification immediately," Marcus demanded, stepping closer to assert his authority. "And you'll need to explain what you're doing in this section of the base." The woman reached into her small shoulder bag, moving slowly and deliberately. Marcus noticed she didn't seem nervous or flustered by his authoritative tone, which only increased his suspicion. Most civilians would be intimidated when confronted by a military officer in full uniform, especially one with his commanding presence. "I have my identification right here," she said calmly, still searching through her bag. "Though I should mention that I don't actually have a visitor's pass." This admission sent a spike of anger through Marcus. Security breaches were taken extremely seriously on military bases, and the fact that this woman had somehow gained access without proper authorization was a serious concern. His training kicked in, and he immediately began assessing her as a potential security threat. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to stop what you're doing and put your hands where I can see them," Marcus ordered, his voice taking on a harder edge. "Unauthorized personnel in restricted areas constitute a security breach, and I'm required to detain you until security can properly investigate." The woman paused in her search through the bag and looked up at him again. There was still no fear in her eyes, which Marcus found both puzzling and infuriating. In his experience, civilians who found themselves in trouble with military personnel usually showed at least some sign of nervousness or concern. "Captain," she said, reading his rank insignia, "I understand your concern about security, but I think there may be a misunderstanding here." "There's no misunderstanding," Marcus replied firmly. You're in a restricted area without authorization, and that's a serious offense. Now, I need you to follow me to the security office where we can sort this out properly." The woman shook her head slightly, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "I appreciate your diligence, Captain Reed," she said, reading his name tag. "But I really do think you should see my identification before we go any further." Marcus was taken aback that she had used his name, though he realized she had simply read it from his uniform. Still, her continued calm demeanor in the face of what should have been a serious situation was beginning to genuinely anger him. He had dealt with plenty of civilians who thought they could talk their way out of trouble with charm or casual conversation, and he had no patience for such tactics. "Ma'am, I've given you clear instructions," Marcus said, his voice rising slightly. "I need you to comply immediately, or this situation is going to escalate quickly." Instead of complying, the woman took a step back and pulled out her tablet again. "Captain Reed, before we continue, I'd like you to take a look at something." The casual defiance was more than Marcus could tolerate. In his mind, this woman was clearly trying to manipulate the situation, possibly to buy time, while destroying evidence or communicating with accomplices. Security protocols were clear about how to handle uncooperative subjects in restricted areas. Without warning, Marcus stepped forward quickly and grabbed the woman by the shoulders, pushing her back against the nearby wall. The move was designed to assert control and prevent her from potentially reaching for a weapon or communication device. His training had taught him that swift, decisive action was often necessary to maintain security and prevent situations from spiraling out of control. "Enough," Marcus said firmly, pinning her against the wall with his body while keeping his hands on her shoulders. "You're going to comply with my instructions right now, or this is going to get much worse for you." The woman's tablet clattered to the floor as Marcus pressed her against the wall. For a moment, the confident composure she had maintained finally cracked, and Marcus saw a flash of surprise and anger in her green eyes. He felt a moment of satisfaction, believing he had finally broken through her act and established proper control of the situation. "Captain Reed," the woman said, her voice now carrying a sharp edge that hadn't been there before, "I strongly suggest you remove your hands from me immediately." Marcus ignored her demand, interpreting it as another attempt to manipulate the situation. "Ma'am, you're under detention for unauthorized access to a military facility and failure to comply with lawful orders from a military officer. You have the right to remain silent, and anything you say can and will be used against you in a military tribunal." The woman's eyes flashed with something that Marcus couldn't quite identify. It wasn't fear or intimidation, as he had expected, but something closer to disbelief and mounting anger. "Captain Reed," she said again, her voice now carrying an unmistakable note of command authority, "I'm ordering you to release me immediately and step back." The way she said it gave Marcus pause. There was something in her tone that reminded him of senior officers, a particular quality of voice that came from years of command experience. But he quickly dismissed the thought. This was clearly a civilian trying to intimidate him with military-sounding language. "Ma'am, civilians don't give orders to military personnel," Marcus replied, maintaining his position. "And your continued resistance is only making this situation worse." The woman took a deep breath, and Marcus could see her struggling to maintain her composure. When she spoke again, her voice was deadly calm. "Captain Reed, my name is Admiral Sarah Chun, and you are currently assaulting a superior officer." Marcus felt as though the floor had dropped out from under him. The words hit him like a physical blow, and for a moment he couldn't process what he had just heard. His grip on her shoulders loosened involuntarily as his mind struggled to make sense of the situation. "That's impossible," he said, though even as the words left his mouth, he could hear the uncertainty in his own voice. "You're not in uniform. You don't have identification." "You're what, Captain?" Admiral Chin asked, her voice now carrying the full weight of command authority. "I'm too young, too female, too casually dressed to be your superior officer." Marcus's hands fell away from her shoulders as the full implications of what she had said began to sink in. If this woman was telling the truth, if she really was the Admiral Chun he had heard about, then he had just committed one of the most serious offenses possible in military service, assaulting a superior officer. Admiral Chun straightened her blouse and picked up her tablet from the floor, her movements controlled and deliberate. When she looked back at Marcus, her expression was a mixture of disappointment and barely controlled anger. "Captain Reed," she said formally, "you have exactly 30 seconds to explain your actions before I decide whether to have you arrested for assault on a superior officer." Marcus felt his career flashing before his eyes. Everything he had worked for, all the years of dedicated service, the respect he had earned from his peers and subordinates, it could all disappear in an instant if he had truly assaulted an admiral. But part of him still couldn't believe the situation was real. "Ma'am," he began, his voice now uncertain and shaky. If you are who you say you are, why weren't you in uniform? Why didn't you have proper identification? How was I supposed to know?" Admiral Chin studied him for a long moment before answering. "Captain, I arrived early and unannounced because I wanted to observe the base operations without the artificial improvements that typically occur when senior officers are expected. I was in civilian clothes because I had traveled commercially and planned to change into uniform once I reached my quarters." Marcus felt his stomach drop as the explanation made perfect sense. It was exactly the kind of unconventional approach that he had heard the new admiral was known for. His mind raced as he tried to figure out how to salvage the situation, but he was beginning to realize that there might be no way back from what he had done. "As for identification," Admiral Chun continued, "I was attempting to show you exactly that when you decided to assault me instead of following proper procedures." The word assault hit Marcus like a slap. In his mind, he had been following security protocols and maintaining order, but viewed from outside his perspective, he could see how his actions might be interpreted very differently, especially by the person on the receiving end. "Ma'am, I sincerely apologize," Marcus said, snapping to attention and saluting. "I was following what I believed to be appropriate security protocols for dealing with unauthorized personnel in restricted areas." Admiral Chun did not return his salute. Instead, she continued to study him with those penetrating green eyes, as if she were trying to see into his very soul and assess what kind of officer he really was. "Captain Reed," she said finally, "in your 15 years of service, have you ever encountered a situation where proper protocol called for physically restraining a cooperative individual who was in the process of providing identification?" The question cut straight to the heart of the matter, and Marcus knew there was no good answer. The woman, Admiral Chun, had been cooperative, if somewhat casual in her attitude. She had been in the process of providing identification when he had decided to escalate the situation physically. "No, ma'am," Marcus admitted, the words feeling like lead in his mouth. Admiral Chun nodded slowly. "And, in your experience, Captain, what is the standard penalty for assault on a superior officer?" Marcus knew the answer all too well. Court-martial, dishonorable discharge, possible imprisonment. His career would be over, and his reputation would be destroyed. Everything he had worked for would be gone. "Court-martial and dismissal from service, ma'am," he answered, his voice barely above a whisper. Admiral Chin picked up her tablet and began walking toward the administrative building, leaving Marcus standing frozen in place. After a few steps, she turned back to look at him. "Captain Reed, report to my office at 0800 hours tomorrow morning," she said. "We'll discuss your future in the Navy then." As she walked away, Marcus remained standing at attention, watching her disappear around a corner. His mind was reeling with the implications of what had just happened. In the span of a few minutes, he had gone from being a confident, successful naval officer to someone facing the potential end of his career. The irony wasn't lost on him. He had built his reputation on discipline, protocol, and proper military bearing. Yet when faced with an unexpected situation, he had abandoned proper procedure and let his assumptions and prejudices guide his actions instead of his training. As Marcus finally began to move, walking slowly back toward his quarters. He couldn't shake the image of Admiral Chen's eyes. Not just the anger he had seen there, but also something else. Disappointment, perhaps, or maybe even a hint of curiosity about who he really was beneath the surface. He spent the rest of the day in a daze, going through the motions of his duties while his mind raced through possible scenarios for the next morning's meeting. Some part of him hoped that Admiral Chen might be willing to overlook the incident, perhaps with some disciplinary action short of court-martial. But he knew that what he had done was serious enough to end his career, and he had no right to expect mercy. That evening, as Marcus sat alone in his quarters, he found himself thinking not just about his own future, but about the assumptions he had made about Admiral Chen. He had seen a young woman in civilian clothes and immediately categorized her as someone who didn't belong, someone who wasn't worthy of respect or proper treatment. The realization was uncomfortable, forcing him to confront aspects of his own character that he had never really examined. Had he become so rigid in his thinking that he could no longer adapt to unexpected situations? Had his commitment to protocol become an excuse for treating others poorly? As he prepared for bed, Marcus knew that tomorrow's meeting would determine not just his future in the Navy, but possibly his understanding of himself as well. Admiral Chen held his career in her hands, and all he could do was hope that when morning came, he would find the right words to explain his actions and perhaps begin to make amends for his serious error in judgment. Marcus Reed barely slept that night. He lay in his narrow military cot, staring at the ceiling while his mind replayed the disastrous encounter with Admiral Chen over and over again. Every time he closed his eyes, he could see her face pressed against the wall, feel the moment when his hands had grabbed her shoulders, hear the authority in her voice when she revealed her true identity. By 0500 hours, he had given up any pretense of sleep and was sitting at his small desk, trying to write what might be his final report as a naval officer. But the words wouldn't come. How could he explain his actions in a way that didn't sound like excuses? How could he justify what he had done when he couldn't even fully understand it himself? At 0630, Marcus showered and put on his dress uniform with extra care, making sure every detail was perfect. If this was to be his last day as a naval officer, he would at least look the part. He polished his shoes until they gleamed, checked his ribbons and insignia twice, and stood before the mirror practicing his salute. The walk to the administrative building felt like a march to his own execution. Other personnel he passed in the corridors seemed to sense something was wrong. Word traveled fast on military bases, and while the specific details might not be known, people could feel when something significant was happening. Commander Patricia Hayes, Marcus's longtime colleague and one of his few close friends on the base, fell in a step beside him as he approached the administrative building. "Marcus," she said quietly, "there are rumors flying around about yesterday. Some people are saying you had a run-in with the new admiral. Please tell me it's not as bad as it sounds." Marcus kept walking, his eyes fixed straight ahead. "It's worse, Pat. Much worse." Patricia grabbed his arm, forcing him to stop. "What do you mean worse? What happened?" For a moment, Marcus considered telling her everything. Patricia had been his confidant through many difficult situations, and her legal background might help him understand his options. But he knew that involving her would only create problems for her career as well. "I can't discuss it," Marcus said finally. "But, Pat, if something happens to me, I want you to know that whatever you hear, I brought it on myself." Patricia's face went pale. "Marcus, you're scaring me. What did you do?" Before Marcus could answer, his phone buzzed with a text message. It was from Admiral Chen's office, confirming his 0800 appointment and instructing him to report to the main conference room rather than her office. The change of venue seemed ominous. Conference rooms were typically used for formal proceedings, not private conversations. Marcus arrived at the conference room at exactly 0755, standing at attention outside the door until his watch showed precisely 0800. Then he knocked twice sharply. "Enter," came Admiral Chen's voice from inside. Marcus opened the door and stepped into the room, immediately snapping to attention and saluting. Captain Marcus Reed reporting as ordered, ma'am. Admiral Chun was seated at the head of a long conference table, now wearing her dress uniform with the 3 stars of a vice admiral clearly visible. The transformation was striking. Gone was any trace of the casually dressed woman from yesterday. In her place sat a clearly senior military officer with an unmistakable aura of command authority. At ease, Captain, Admiral Chun said, returning his salute. Please take a seat. Marcus sat in the chair indicated, maintaining perfect posture despite his nervousness. Admiral Chun studied him for several long moments before speaking. Captain Reed, I've spent considerable time since yesterday reviewing your service record, she began. 15 years of exemplary service, multiple commendations for tactical excellence, strong leadership ratings from your subordinates. By all accounts, you're exactly the kind of officer the Navy needs and wants to retain. Marcus felt a flicker of hope, though he tried not to let it show on his face. However, Admiral Chun continued, yesterday's incident raises serious questions about your judgment and your ability to adapt to unexpected situations. I'd like to hear your perspective on what happened. Marcus had rehearsed this moment in his mind dozens of times during the sleepless night, but now that it was here, his carefully prepared words seemed inadequate. Ma'am, there is no excuse for my actions yesterday, he began. I failed to follow proper procedures, made assumptions based on appearance rather than facts, and acted inappropriately toward a superior officer. I take full responsibility for my conduct. Admiral Chun nodded slightly. That's a start, Captain. But I'm more interested in understanding why it happened than in hearing you accept responsibility. What was going through your mind when you decided to physically restrain me? The question forced Marcus to confront the uncomfortable truth about his own thought process. Ma'am, I believed I was dealing with a security breach. When you didn't immediately comply with my demands for identification, I interpreted your calm demeanor as potential deception or manipulation. And what led you to that interpretation? Marcus hesitated, knowing that his answer would reveal unflattering aspects of his character. I suppose I expected you to be more intimidated by my authority. When you weren't, I assumed you were being deliberately uncooperative. Admiral Chun leaned back in her chair. So you believe that fear was the appropriate response to your authority? The question hit Marcus like a physical blow. Put that way, his attitude sounded not just wrong, but fundamentally contrary to everything the military was supposed to represent. No, ma'am, Marcus said quietly. Respect, not fear, should be the foundation of military authority. Yet when you didn't receive what you interpreted as proper fear, you escalated to physical force. Marcus felt his face burning with shame. Yes, ma'am, that's exactly what I did. Admiral Chun stood and walked to the window overlooking the base. Captain Reed, in my experience, officers who rely on intimidation rather than earned respect typically do so because they're insecure about their own authority. Does that assessment seem accurate? The question forced Marcus to examine his own motivations in a way he never had before. Had his rigid adherence to protocol been a mask for deeper insecurities? Had his quick temper and demanding nature been compensation for feelings of inadequacy? I believe it might be, ma'am, Marcus admitted, the words feeling strange in his mouth. Admiral Chun turned back to face him. Captain, I want to tell you about my own career path. I was promoted to Admiral at 32, making me one of the youngest flag officers in naval history. Do you know what the most common reaction was to my promotion? Marcus shook his head, though he suspected he could guess. Surprise, skepticism, and in some cases, outright hostility. Many people assumed I had received preferential treatment or that politics rather than merit had driven my advancement. I learned very quickly that I would have to prove myself over and over again, often to people who had already decided I didn't deserve my position. Marcus began to understand where this was leading, and the realization was deeply uncomfortable. Yesterday, Admiral Chun continued, when you saw a young woman in civilian clothes, you made assumptions about who I was and what I was doing there. Those assumptions led you to treat me in a way that you would never have treated a male officer, even one you suspected of unauthorized access. The truth of her words hit Marcus like a sledgehammer. If he had encountered a middle-aged man in civilian clothes, would he have been so quick to escalate to physical force? Would he have dismissed explanations so readily? Ma'am, I don't want to believe that gender bias influenced my actions, but I can't honestly say it didn't, Marcus said. The possibility that it did makes my behavior even more inexcusable. Admiral Chun returned to her seat. Captain Reed, I appreciate your honesty. The question now is what we do about this situation. You assaulted a superior officer based on assumptions and bias rather than facts and proper procedure. That's grounds for court-martial and dismissal from service. Marcus felt his heart sink, knowing that he had no argument against her assessment. However, Admiral Chun continued, I'm more interested in whether this incident represents who you truly are or whether it's an aberration that can be corrected. Marcus looked up, surprised by the direction the conversation was taking. Ma'am, I would like to believe it's an aberration, but I'm no longer sure. Yesterday forced me to confront aspects of my own character that I didn't know existed, or perhaps didn't want to acknowledge. Admiral Chin nodded approvingly. That kind of self-awareness is a good starting point. Captain, I'm going to offer you a choice. You can face a court-martial for assault on a superior officer, which will likely result in dishonorable discharge and possible imprisonment. Or you can accept an alternative consequence that I believe will be more beneficial for both you and the Navy. Marcus felt a surge of hope mixed with apprehension. What kind of alternative consequence, ma'am? Admiral Chen pulled out a thick folder and placed it on the table. I'm assigning you to a special project that I'll be overseeing personally. You'll be working directly under my command on a sensitive mission that requires the kind of tactical expertise you've demonstrated throughout your career. Marcus was stunned. This was the last thing he had expected. Ma'am, I don't understand. Why would you want to work with someone who assaulted you? Admiral Chin smiled for the first time since he had entered the room. Captain Reed, in my experience, people who are capable of genuine self-reflection and growth are rare and valuable. Yesterday, you made a serious error in judgment, but your response today suggests that you're capable of learning from it. Marcus felt overwhelmed by the unexpected turn of events. Ma'am, I don't feel like I deserve a second chance. Perhaps you don't, Admiral Chun replied bluntly. But the Navy has invested 15 years in your training and development. Throwing that away serves no one's interests unless you're truly beyond redemption, which I don't believe you are. Admiral Chin opened the folder and pulled out several documents. This assignment will not be easy, Captain. You'll be working closely with me on a daily basis, which means I'll be in a position to observe your judgment, your decision-making, and your ability to treat all personnel with appropriate respect regardless of their appearance, background, or gender. Marcus nodded, beginning to understand the nature of what she was offering. It wasn't just a second chance. It was an opportunity to prove that he could change and grow. The mission itself involves establishing new protocols for base security and personnel management, Admiral Chin continued. Ironically, it's directly related to the kind of situation we encountered yesterday. We need to develop procedures that maintain security while ensuring that all personnel are treated with dignity and respect. The irony wasn't lost on Marcus. He would be working to create the very protocols that might have prevented his own mistake. Ma'am, what exactly will my role be in this project? Admiral Chun handed him a document outlining the assignment. You'll be my executive officer for this project, which means you'll have significant responsibility for implementation and oversight. But, Captain, understand that this is not a reward or a promotion. This is an opportunity for redemption that you'll have to earn every single day. Marcus scanned the document, noting the scope and complexity of the project. It was clearly an important assignment, one that would have significant impact on base operations and potentially naval policy more broadly. Ma'am, I accept the assignment, but I need to ask, what happens if I fail to meet your expectations? Admiral Chin's expression became serious again. Then, The court-martial option remains available, Captain. This isn't a free pass. It's a chance to prove that yesterday was an aberration rather than a pattern. Marcus understood completely. He was being given an opportunity that he didn't deserve, and the expectations would be correspondingly high. "I won't fail you, ma'am," Marcus said firmly. Admiral Chin studied him for a moment. "Captain Reed, I don't want you to focus on not failing me. I want you to focus on becoming the officer I believe you can be. One who treats all personnel with respect, who makes decisions based on facts rather than assumptions, and who earns authority through competence and integrity rather than intimidation." The conversation continued for another hour as Admiral Chun outlined the specifics of the assignment and her expectations for Marcus's performance. By the time he left the conference room, Marcus felt as though his entire worldview had been turned upside down. As he walked back through the corridors of the base, Marcus saw the familiar environment with new eyes. How many times had he passed judgment on personnel based on their appearance or demeanor? How many opportunities had he missed to mentor younger officers because he was too focused on maintaining his own authority? The assignment Admiral Chun had given him was more than just professional responsibility. It was a chance to fundamentally reshape his approach to leadership and his understanding of what it meant to be a naval officer. That evening, Marcus sat in his quarters with the project documents spread across his desk. As he read through the materials, he began to understand the full scope of what Admiral Chun was trying to accomplish. The new protocols weren't just about security procedures. They were about creating an environment where all personnel could perform at their best without fear of discrimination or unfair treatment. It was, he realized, exactly the kind of environment that might have prevented the previous day's incident entirely. And now he had the opportunity to help create it, working under the supervision of the very person he had wronged. As Marcus prepared for bed, he found himself thinking not about what he had almost lost, but about what he might be able to gain. For the first time in years, he felt genuinely challenged in a way that went beyond tactical planning or mission execution. Admiral Chun had given him the chance to prove that he could change, grow, and become a better officer and a better person. The question now was whether he would rise to meet that challenge or prove that her faith in him had been misplaced. As he turned off the lights in his quarters, Marcus made a silent promise to himself that he would not waste this unexpected second chance. 3 weeks into his assignment as Admiral Chin's executive officer, Marcus Reed was discovering that everything he thought he knew about leadership was being challenged on a daily basis. The project they were working on, developing new security and personnel management protocols, had forced him to examine not just policies and procedures, but the underlying assumptions that drove military culture. Admiral Chin's approach to leadership was unlike anything Marcus had experienced in his 15 years of service. She led by example rather than intimidation, sought input from personnel at all levels rather than simply issuing orders, and treated every interaction as an opportunity to mentor and develop the people under her command. Marcus was assigned a small office adjacent to Admiral Chin's, and the proximity meant he observed her management style constantly. He watched her conduct meetings where junior enlisted personnel felt comfortable offering suggestions, saw her take time to explain the reasoning behind decisions rather than simply expecting blind obedience, and witnessed her ability to maintain authority while treating everyone with genuine respect and dignity. The contrast with his own previous leadership approach was stark and often uncomfortable to confront. "Captain Reed," Admiral Chun said one morning as she reviewed a draft protocol he had written, "this section about visitor screening procedures reads more like a military occupation manual than a security guideline. What message do you think this tone sends to people who are legitimately trying to access the base?" Marcus looked at the document with fresh eyes, trying to see it from the perspective of someone who wasn't steeped in military culture. The language was harsh, authoritative, and focused entirely on potential threats rather than balancing security with courtesy. "It sends the message that we view everyone as a potential enemy until proven otherwise," Marcus admitted. "That's not exactly welcoming or professional." Admiral Chin nodded. "And How might that approach affect our relationships with civilian contractors, family members of personnel, and community leaders who need to visit the base for legitimate business? The question forced Marcus to think beyond the immediate security concerns to the broader implications of policy decisions. It would create an adversarial atmosphere that could damage community relations and make it harder for us to accomplish our mission. Exactly. Now, how might we rewrite this section to maintain security while treating visitors with appropriate respect and courtesy? Over the following days, Marcus worked to revise the protocols, struggling to find language that was both security-conscious and respectful. It was more challenging than he had expected, requiring him to think carefully about tone, word choice, and the psychological impact of policies on the people who would be affected by them. The exercise was teaching him that effective leadership required consideration of how decisions would be received and implemented, not just whether they achieved immediate tactical objectives. During the second week of their collaboration, Admiral Chun assigned Marcus to conduct interviews with base personnel about their experiences with existing security procedures. The assignment was clearly designed to expose him to perspectives he might not have considered before. Petty Officer Second Class Maria Santos was among the first people Marcus interviewed. She was a young communications specialist who had been on the base for 2 years, and her insights were eye-opening. "Captain, can I speak honestly?" Maria asked after Marcus had explained the purpose of the interview. "Of course, Petty Officer Santos. That's exactly what we need." Maria seemed to gather her courage before continuing. "The current visitor screening process is really difficult for families. My husband is a civilian contractor, and every time he comes to pick me up or drop something off, he gets treated like he's suspicious just for existing. The guards act like he's probably up to something criminal, and it's embarrassing." Marcus found himself remembering his own encounter with Admiral Chun, when his assumptions about her civilian clothes and presence had led him to treat her as a threat rather than gathering information first. "What specifically about the process makes it feel unwelcoming?" Marcus asked. "It's not just one thing," Maria explained. "It's the tone of voice the guards use, the way they act like every question is an interrogation, and how they make you feel like you're bothering them by following the required procedures. My husband actually avoids coming on base now unless it's absolutely necessary." As Marcus conducted more interviews, he began to see a pattern. Personnel consistently reported that security procedures, while necessary, were often implemented in ways that created tension and discomfort rather than genuine security. Guards who viewed their role as catching wrongdoers rather than facilitating legitimate access created an atmosphere of suspicion that affected everyone. The feedback was a mirror reflection of his own behavior during the incident with Admiral Chun. He had approached the situation looking for problems rather than seeking to understand and assist. One particularly impactful interview was with Commander Lisa Park, a senior officer who had recently transferred from another base. Her perspective offered a comparison point that was both instructive and troubling. "Captain Reed, I've served on 8 different bases during my career," Commander Park explained, "and this base has some of the most competent personnel I've worked with. But the culture here tends towards suspicion and rigid hierarchy in a way that actually makes us less effective. Can you give me a specific example?" Marcus asked. Commander Park considered her answer carefully. "Last week, I observed a situation where a junior enlisted person had identified a potential problem with equipment maintenance. Rather than reporting it through proper channels, she chose to handle it herself because she was afraid that raising the issue would be seen as criticism of her supervisor." Marcus felt a chill of recognition. How many times had he created an environment where subordinates were afraid to bring him problems or suggestions because they feared his reaction? The result, Commander Park continued, was that a minor issue became a major equipment failure that could have been prevented. "We lost 3 days of operational capability because our culture discourages the kind of open communication that would have caught the problem early." These interviews were forcing Marcus to confront the unintended consequences of his leadership style. His focus on discipline and protocol had created an environment where people were afraid to communicate openly, which ultimately made the unit less effective rather than more so. Admiral Chun reviewed his interview notes at the end of each week, asking thoughtful questions that pushed him to dig deeper into the implications of what he was learning. "Captain Reed," she said during one of their weekly review sessions, "what patterns are you seeing in these interviews?" Marcus had been dreading this conversation because he knew his conclusions would reflect poorly on his own past leadership. "Ma'am, the consistent theme is that our emphasis on rigid hierarchy and suspicion-based security is creating barriers to effective communication and mission accomplishment." Admiral Chun nodded. "And what do you think has contributed to this culture?" Marcus knew he couldn't avoid the uncomfortable truth. "Leadership that prioritizes control over effectiveness, ma'am. Officers like myself who have focused more on maintaining authority than on creating environments where people can do their best work." The admission was painful, but necessary. Marcus was beginning to understand that his rigid approach to leadership had been counterproductive in ways he had never recognized. During the third week of the assignment, Admiral Chun began including Marcus in higher-level meetings where policy decisions were made. These sessions provided him with insight into how senior leadership approached complex problems, and the contrast with his own decision-making process was stark. In one meeting about base emergency response procedures, Marcus watched Admiral Chun facilitate a discussion that included input from personnel ranging from senior officers to junior enlisted specialists. Rather than simply announcing decisions, she guided a collaborative process that resulted in better solutions than any individual could have developed alone. "Captain Reed," Admiral Chun asked him after the meeting, "what did you observe about how decisions were made in there?" Marcus had been taking notes throughout the session, trying to understand the methodology behind what he had witnessed. "Ma'am, you gathered input from multiple perspectives before reaching conclusions. Ask questions that help people think through implications they might not have considered, and ensured that everyone understood not just what the decisions were, but why they were made. And how does that compare to your typical decision-making process?" The question forced Marcus to confront another uncomfortable truth about his leadership approach. "I typically made decisions based on my own analysis and experience, then communicated the results to subordinates without explaining the reasoning or seeking their input." Admiral Chun leaned back in her chair. "What are the advantages and disadvantages of each approach?" Marcus had been thinking about this question throughout the meeting. "Your approach takes more time initially, but it results in better decisions because you're working with more information. It also means that people understand and support the decisions because they were part of the process." "And your approach?" "My approach was faster in the short term, but it often resulted in decisions based on incomplete information. And when people don't understand the reasoning behind decisions, they're less likely to implement them effectively." The conversation continued for another hour, with Admiral Chun helping Marcus understand the connection between leadership style and organizational effectiveness. By the end of their discussion, Marcus felt as though he was learning an entirely new approach to military leadership. That evening, Marcus sat in his quarters reflecting on how much his understanding had changed in just 3 weeks. The assignment Admiral Chun had given him was proving to be far more transformative than he had expected. He wasn't just learning new policies and procedures. He was developing a completely different philosophy of leadership. The most challenging aspect of this transformation was acknowledging how wrong he had been about so many things. His approach to leadership, his understanding of effective communication, his assumptions about what motivated people, all of it was being challenged and rebuilt from the ground up. But the most surprising discovery was how much more enjoyable and fulfilling this new approach to leadership was proving to be. Working collaboratively rather than through intimidation, seeking to understand rather than simply to control, treating people as valuable contributors rather than potential problems. It was more engaging and ultimately more effective than anything he had tried before. As Marcus prepared for bed, he found himself looking forward to the next day's work in a way he hadn't experienced in years. For the first time in his career, He felt like he was learning skills that would make him not just a more effective officer, but a better person. The transformation wasn't complete. He still caught himself falling back into old patterns of thinking and reacting. But Admiral Chin's patient guidance and the constant exposure to new perspectives were gradually helping him develop a more thoughtful and effective approach to leadership. 3 weeks earlier, Marcus had been facing the end of his career and the destruction of everything he had worked to build. Now, he was beginning to understand that what was being destroyed were the flawed assumptions and counterproductive habits that had been limiting his potential all along. Admiral Chun had given him more than just a second chance. She had given him the opportunity to discover what kind of leader he was truly capable of becoming. And for the first time since the incident that had started this journey, Marcus felt hopeful about his future and confident that he was finally learning lessons that would serve him and the Navy well for years to come. The real test, he knew, would come when he had to apply these new insights under pressure, in situations where his old instincts would be pushing him toward familiar but counterproductive responses. But for now, Marcus was focused on learning as much as he could from the exceptional leader who had chosen to invest in his development rather than simply ending his career. The question was whether he would prove worthy of that investment when the real challenges inevitably arose. 6 weeks into his assignment with Admiral Chun, Marcus Reed faced his first major test of the leadership principles he had been learning. A security incident at the base's main gate threatened to escalate into exactly the kind of situation that had defined his old approach to command, and everything he had learned would be put to the test under pressure. The incident began on a Tuesday morning when the base's automated security system flagged an incoming visitor as a potential threat. Dr. James Harrison, a civilian researcher from a prestigious university, had arrived for a scheduled meeting with the base's engineering team to discuss a classified defense project. However, the security database showed a flag on his record due to a minor arrest during a peaceful protest 15 years earlier. Lieutenant Jake Morrison, the young officer in charge of gate security that morning, was facing his first significant security decision. Following standard protocol, he detained Dr. Harrison and immediately called for senior officer assistance. Within minutes, word of the situation had reached Admiral Chun and Marcus. "Captain Reed," Admiral Chun said as they hurried toward the main gate, "this is exactly the kind of situation where our new protocols will be tested in real time. I want you to take the lead on resolving this incident." Marcus felt his heart rate spike as they approached the gate. This was the moment he had been dreading, a situation where his old instincts would be screaming at him to take control through authority and intimidation, while his new training pushed him toward a more measured and collaborative approach. As they arrived at the security checkpoint, Marcus could see Dr. Harrison standing near the guard station, looking frustrated but not hostile. Lieutenant Morrison appeared nervous and uncertain, clearly uncomfortable with the responsibility of making decisions about the situation. Marcus's first impulse was to march over and demand answers from both the visitor and the guard. His old approach would have been to assert control immediately, make quick judgments based on limited information, and prioritize appearing decisive over gathering facts. Instead, Marcus took a deep breath and approached Lieutenant Morrison first. "Lieutenant Morrison," Marcus said calmly, "please brief me on the situation and the actions you've taken so far." Morrison straightened to attention, clearly relieved to have senior leadership involved. "Sir, Dr. Harrison arrived for his scheduled 0900 meeting with the engineering team. When I ran his identification through our security system, it flagged him due to a prior arrest record. Per protocol, I detained him pending senior officer review." Marcus nodded, noting that Morrison had followed procedures correctly. "Have you verified the authenticity of his identification and the legitimacy of his scheduled meeting?" "Yes, sir. Both check out." The engineering team confirmed his appointment, and his identification appears genuine. Marcus then approached Dr. Harrison, who was clearly becoming increasingly frustrated with the delay. "Dr. Harrison, I'm Captain Reed. I understand there's been a complication with your security clearance. I'd like to get this resolved as quickly as possible. Can you help me understand the nature of your visit today? Dr. Harrison's expression softened slightly at Marcus's respectful tone. Captain, I'm here to discuss some research findings that could significantly improve the base's energy efficiency systems. I was arrested once 15 years ago during a peaceful environmental protest, but I can't understand why that would be relevant to my work here. Marcus felt Admiral Chun watching from a distance as he gathered information. His old approach would have been to view Dr. Harrison's protest history as evidence of potential disloyalty or untrustworthiness. But his recent training had taught him to look beyond surface-level information to understand the full context of situations. Dr. Harrison, can you tell me more about the nature of that protest and your current views on defense-related research? Of course, Dr. Harrison replied. It was a climate change demonstration outside a coal plant, completely nonviolent, and honestly, it led me to focus my research on clean energy technologies that could help both civilian and military applications. That's actually why I'm here, to share research that could help the military reduce its environmental footprint while improving operational efficiency. Marcus processed this information, recognizing that Dr. Harrison's past protest activity was actually related to the work he was now doing to help the military. Rather than being a security concern, it was evidence of consistent principles that had led him to useful research. Lieutenant Morrison, Marcus said, please contact the engineering team and inform them that Dr. Harrison will be arriving shortly for his meeting. Also, prepare a visitor's badge with appropriate access level for the research facility. Morrison looked uncertain. Sir, what about the security flag on his record? Marcus realized this was a teaching moment, not just for Morrison, but for everyone watching the situation unfold. Lieutenant, the flag in the system indicates that Dr. Harrison was arrested 15 years ago for peaceful protest activity related to environmental concerns. That same concern has led him to research that may benefit our operations. The flag requires us to gather additional information, which we've done. Based on that information, there's no current security concern. Admiral Chin approached as Marcus finished speaking. Captain Reed, could you walk me through your assessment of the situation? Marcus knew this was a crucial moment. Admiral Chun was evaluating not just his handling of the immediate problem, but his application of the leadership principles she had been teaching him. Ma'am, we had a security system flag that required investigation. Lieutenant Morrison followed proper procedures by detaining the visitor and requesting senior officer review. Upon investigation, the flag was based on historical information that doesn't indicate a current security risk. Dr. Harrison's appointment is legitimate. His research appears beneficial to our operations, and there's no evidence of current security concerns. Admiral Chin nodded. And what lessons might we draw from this incident for future protocol development? Marcus had been thinking about exactly this question as he managed the situation. Ma'am, this incident highlights the importance of context in security decisions. Our current system flags historical information without providing tools for officers to quickly assess whether that information is relevant to current security concerns. We might consider developing protocols that help gate personnel make more nuanced judgments about flagged individuals. Dr. Harrison, who had been listening to this conversation, stepped forward. Captain, Admiral, if I may, I appreciate how you've handled this situation. I've visited military bases before where similar flags have resulted in hours of detention and hostile treatment. Your approach has been both professional and efficient. After Dr. Harrison left for his meeting, Admiral Chin asked Marcus to join her for a debrief of the incident. Captain Reed, she said as they walked back toward the administrative building, how do you feel about how that situation was resolved? Marcus considered his answer carefully. Ma'am, I'm satisfied with the outcome, but I'm more interested in what I learned about applying the principles we've been developing. 6 weeks ago, I would have handled that situation very differently. How so? I would have focused on asserting control and making quick decisions based on limited information. I probably would have treated Dr. Harrison's protest history as evidence of unreliability, and I would have prioritized appearing decisive over gathering facts. Admiral Chin smiled. And what made the difference today? Marcus thought about the specific moments during the incident when he had consciously chosen different approaches than his instincts suggested. I focused on gathering information before making judgments, treated everyone involved with respect while maintaining appropriate security concerns, and tried to see the situation from multiple perspectives rather than just from a threat assessment standpoint. The conversation continued as they reached Admiral Chen's office. What had seemed like a routine security matter had become a comprehensive test of everything Marcus had been learning about leadership, decision-making, and the importance of treating people with dignity while maintaining necessary security measures. Later that afternoon, Marcus received an unexpected visit from Lieutenant Morrison, who knocked on his office door with a somewhat nervous expression. "Captain Reed, do you have a moment? I wanted to ask you about the incident this morning." Marcus gestured for Morrison to take a seat. "Of course, Lieutenant. What's on your mind?" Morrison seemed to struggle with how to phrase his question. "Sir, I followed the protocols exactly as they're written, but watching you handle the situation made me realize that the protocols don't really prepare us for making the kind of judgments you made today. How did you know what questions to ask?" The question gave Marcus an opportunity to share some of what he had been learning from Admiral Chen. "Lieutenant, the protocols are starting points, not ending points. They ensure we don't overlook important security concerns, but they can't make decisions for us. The key is gathering enough information to understand the full context of a situation." Marcus spent the next hour with Morrison, discussing how to approach security decisions that required judgment beyond simple protocol compliance. It was the first time Marcus had found himself in a teaching role since beginning his assignment with Admiral Chun, and he discovered that explaining these concepts to someone else helped reinforce his own understanding. The conversation with Morrison also helped Marcus realize how much his perspective had changed. 6 weeks earlier, he would have viewed Morrison's questions as evidence of inadequate training or indecisiveness. Now, he saw them as signs of an engaged officer who wanted to understand how to make better decisions. That evening, Marcus reviewed the incident report he had written about the morning's events. As he read through his own account, he was struck by how different his approach to documentation had become. Rather than focusing solely on justifying his actions, the report analyzed what had worked well, what could be improved, and what lessons might be applied to future situations. The document reflected a new understanding of his role, not just as someone who made decisions, but as someone who could contribute to the continuous improvement of military procedures and culture. 3 days after the Dr. Harrison incident, Admiral Chun called Marcus into her office for what she described as a midpoint evaluation of his assignment. "Captain Reed," she began, "we're halfway through your assignment, and I think this is a good time to assess your progress and discuss what comes next." Marcus felt nervous about the evaluation, though not in the same way he had felt about their first meeting 6 weeks earlier. Then, he had been afraid of losing his career. Now, he was concerned about whether he was living up to the potential Admiral Chun had seen in him. "Sir, I feel like I've learned more in the past 6 weeks than in the previous several years of my career," Marcus said. "The Dr. Harrison incident was the first time I had to apply these principles under pressure, and I think it went well, but I know I still have a lot to learn." Admiral Chen nodded. "Your handling of that incident demonstrated significant growth in your approach to leadership and decision-making. But I'm more interested in your assessment of what's changed in your thinking." Marcus had been reflecting on exactly this question. "Ma'am, the biggest change is that I no longer see leadership as primarily about control and authority. I'm beginning to understand that effective leadership is about creating environments where people can do their best work while maintaining the standards and discipline necessary for mission success." The evaluation continued for another hour, with Admiral Chun asking detailed questions about specific situations Marcus had encountered and how his approach had evolved. By the end of their conversation, Marcus felt confident that he was making the kind of progress that justified Admiral Chen's investment in his development. But he also knew that the real test was still to come. The second half of his assignment would involve more complex challenges and greater responsibility for implementing the new protocols they had been developing. The question was whether he could maintain his new approach under even greater pressure and more demanding circumstances. As Marcus left Admiral Chen's office that afternoon, he felt a sense of anticipation about the challenges ahead rather than the anxiety that had characterized his earlier weeks in the assignment. For the first time in his career, he felt like he was truly learning skills that would make him not just a more effective officer, but a leader who could bring out the best in the people around him. 3 months after the incident that had nearly ended his career, Marcus Reed found himself facing the most significant challenge of his professional life. Admiral Chen had assigned him to lead the implementation of their new security and personnel management protocols across 3 different military installations, effectively testing whether his transformation as a leader was genuine and sustainable under the most demanding circumstances. The assignment came with a promotion recommendation to the rank of commander, contingent upon successful completion of the implementation project. More importantly to Marcus, it represented Admiral Chen's confidence that he had truly changed as both an officer and a person. "Captain Reed," Admiral Chen said during their final briefing before his departure, "this assignment will test everything you've learned over the past 3 months. You'll be working with personnel who don't know about your background or your previous leadership style, which means you'll be evaluated purely on your current performance." Marcus understood the significance of this opportunity. Unlike his work under Admiral Chen's direct supervision, where people knew he was undergoing a form of remedial training, this assignment would require him to demonstrate leadership effectiveness with no safety net and no special consideration for his learning process. His first assignment was at Naval Air Station Pensacola, where he would work with Captain Jennifer Walsh, the base commander, to implement the new protocols while training her staff on the updated procedures. Captain Walsh was known throughout the Navy as an exceptionally competent officer with high standards and little patience for incompetence. Marcus arrived at Pensacola on a humid Monday morning, carrying with him the comprehensive protocol manuals that he and Admiral Chen had developed over the past 3 months. More importantly, he carried with him a completely different understanding of what it meant to be a military leader. His first meeting with Captain Walsh took place in her office overlooking the flight line. As he watched aircraft taking off and landing through her windows, Marcus found himself reflecting on how different this meeting felt compared to similar encounters in his past. "Captain Reed," Captain Walsh began, "Admiral Chen speaks very highly of your work on these new protocols. I'm interested to hear your perspective on what we're trying to accomplish here." 6 months earlier, Marcus would have launched into a detailed technical explanation of the procedures and requirements, focusing on compliance and implementation timelines. Now, he found himself thinking about the underlying principles and objectives that the protocols were designed to achieve. "Captain Walsh, the protocols we've developed are really tools for creating an environment where security and respect can coexist," Marcus explained. "We found that when personnel feel treated with dignity and understand the reasoning behind security measures, they actually become more effective partners in maintaining security rather than obstacles to be managed." Captain Walsh leaned back in her chair, studying Marcus with obvious interest. "That's an interesting perspective. Most protocol implementations I've seen focus primarily on compliance and standardization." Marcus nodded. "We discovered that focusing solely on compliance often creates unintended consequences that actually reduce overall effectiveness. When people understand not just what they're supposed to do, but why they're doing it, they're much more likely to use good judgment in situations that aren't explicitly covered by written procedures." The conversation continued for another hour, with Captain Walsh asking detailed questions about specific aspects of the protocols and the philosophy behind them. Marcus found himself drawing not just on the technical knowledge he had gained, but on the deeper insights about human nature and organizational effectiveness that Admiral Chen had helped him develop. By the end of their meeting, Marcus felt confident that Captain Walsh understood and supported the approach they were taking. More importantly, he realized that his ability to explain and advocate for these concepts had improved dramatically since he had begun working with Admiral Chen. The real test came the following day when Marcus began conducting training sessions with the base's security personnel. These sessions would determine whether he could effectively teach others the principles he had learned and whether his new leadership approach would be respected by personnel who had no prior relationship with him. Chief Petty Officer Sarah Rodriguez, the senior enlisted person responsible for gate security operations, was among the first group Marcus trained. Her experience and expertise made her opinion particularly influential with the other security personnel. Captain Reed, Chief Rodriguez, said during a break in the training, "I have to say, this approach is pretty different from what we usually see in protocol updates. Most of the time, we get handed new rules and told to follow them. You're actually explaining why these procedures make sense." Marcus felt a surge of satisfaction, not just because the training was being well received, but because he was successfully applying the teaching methods that Admiral Chun had demonstrated. Chief Rodriguez, "In my experience, people perform much better when they understand the reasoning behind what they're being asked to do. These protocols only work if everyone buys into the underlying principles." The training sessions continued for a week, with Marcus working with different groups of personnel at various levels throughout the organization. Each session taught him something new about how to communicate effectively with different audiences and how to adapt his message while maintaining the core principles he was trying to convey. One particularly challenging moment came when Petty Officer Mike Thompson, a gate guard with 8 years of experience, questioned whether the new protocols were too lenient to maintain proper security. "Captain, with respect," Thompson said during a training session, "some of these procedures seem like they could create security vulnerabilities. If we're too focused on being polite and respectful, aren't we risking mission security?" The question went directly to the heart of one of the most important insights Marcus had gained during his time with Admiral Chun, that respect and security were not opposing forces, but could actually reinforce each other when properly balanced. Marcus took a moment to consider his response, drawing on both his technical knowledge and the real-world examples he had observed. "Petty Officer Thompson, that's an excellent question, and it gets to something really important about how we think about security." Marcus then walked the group through several scenarios, including the Dr. Harrison incident he had managed months earlier, demonstrating how respectful treatment actually enhanced security by encouraging cooperation and reducing the likelihood of confrontations that could escalate into real problems. "The key insight," Marcus explained, "is that most people want to comply with security procedures when they understand their purpose and feel treated with dignity during the process. When we create adversarial interactions unnecessarily, we actually reduce our ability to identify and respond to genuine security threats." By the end of the discussion, Thompson and several other initially skeptical personnel were nodding in understanding. Marcus realized that his ability to address concerns and build consensus had improved dramatically since his assignment began. The second phase of Marcus's assignment took him to Naval Station Norfolk, where he worked with Commander Lisa Park, the same officer who had provided such valuable insights during his earlier interviews about base culture and communication. "Captain Reed," Commander Park said when he arrived, "I'm particularly interested to see how you've translated Admiral Chen's leadership principles into practical implementation guidance. Our personnel here have some unique challenges that will test how adaptable these protocols really are." Norfolk's challenges were indeed more complex than those at Pensacola. The base handled a much higher volume of diverse visitors, from foreign military officials to congressional delegations to family members of deployed personnel. The security requirements were correspondingly more complex, with multiple levels of clearance and access that had to be managed efficiently without creating bureaucratic obstacles. Marcus spent his first week at Norfolk observing existing procedures and talking with personnel about their experiences and challenges. This time, however, his approach to these conversations was informed by months of experience in conducting such interviews and a much deeper understanding of the connection between individual experiences and organizational effectiveness. Petty Officer First Class David Chun, the senior Gates supervisor, provided particularly valuable insights during their initial conversation. "Captain Reed, the biggest challenge we face here is balancing efficiency with thoroughness," Chun explained. "We process hundreds of visitors every day, and Any procedure that slows things down significantly creates bottlenecks that affect base operations. But we can't compromise security for the sake of speed. Marcus recognized this as exactly the kind of complex challenge that the new protocols were designed to address. Rather than viewing efficiency and security as competing priorities, the protocols were structured to make security procedures more efficient by reducing unnecessary friction and conflict. Over the following weeks, Marcus worked with Norfolk's personnel to adapt the protocols to their specific operational requirements. The process required extensive collaboration and problem-solving as they encountered situations that weren't explicitly addressed in the original guidelines. This adaptation process became one of the most valuable aspects of Marcus's assignment, as it forced him to apply the underlying principles of the protocols in creative ways rather than simply implementing predetermined procedures. He found himself serving as a facilitator and consultant rather than just a trainer, helping personnel think through how to apply new concepts to their unique circumstances. The most significant test of both Marcus's leadership and the effectiveness of the protocols came during his final week at Norfolk, when the base received an unexpected visit from a congressional oversight committee. The committee's arrival was announced only hours in advance, creating exactly the kind of high-pressure situation where security personnel might be tempted to default to overly aggressive procedures. Marcus was in the Security Operations Center when the notification came through, and he watched as the gate personnel prepared for the congressional visit using the new protocols they had been implementing. Rather than creating a hostile checkpoint atmosphere focused on demonstrating security theater, the personnel established a respectful but thorough screening process that treated the congressional delegation with appropriate courtesy while maintaining necessary security measures. The visit proceeded smoothly, with no incidents or complaints from either the congressional staff or the base personnel. More importantly, Marcus observed that the security team handled the pressure situation by applying principles rather than just following rigid procedures, exactly as the protocols were designed to encourage. Commander Park later told Marcus that the congressional delegation had specifically commented on the professionalism and efficiency of the security procedures, noting that their experience at Norfolk had been significantly better than at other military installations they had visited. Marcus's final assignment took him to Naval Station Great Lakes, where he worked with Captain Robert Martinez to implement the protocols at the Navy's largest training facility. This assignment presented unique challenges because it involved training personnel who would eventually be deployed to installations throughout the Navy, making their understanding of these principles particularly important for the long-term success of the initiative. The training facility environment was unlike anything Marcus had experienced before. Thousands of new recruits were constantly cycling through various stages of basic training and specialized instruction, creating a dynamic and constantly changing personnel situation that tested the adaptability of the new protocols. Working with Captain Martinez, Marcus developed training modules that could be integrated into existing curricula, ensuring that new Navy personnel would learn these principles as part of their basic military education rather than as an add-on to existing procedures. The most rewarding aspect of this assignment was observing how quickly new recruits absorbed and applied the principles when they were presented as integral to military professionalism rather than as special requirements. Young personnel who had no pre-existing assumptions about military culture readily embraced approaches that balanced respect with discipline. During his final week at Great Lakes, Marcus conducted a training session for drill instructors who would be responsible for teaching these principles to future recruits. The session represented the culmination of his assignment and his transformation as a leader. The key insight that we want every new sailor to understand, Marcus told the assembled drill instructors, is that military discipline and respect for human dignity are not opposing forces. In fact, the most effective military organizations are those where discipline is maintained through shared commitment to excellence rather than through fear or intimidation. As he spoke to the group, Marcus reflected on how completely his understanding of leadership had changed since his encounter with Admiral Chin 6 months earlier. The transformation had been painful, requiring him to confront and abandoned deeply ingrained assumptions about authority, control, and human nature. But the results spoke for themselves. Over the course of his 3-installation assignment, Marcus had successfully implemented complex organizational changes, earned the respect of personnel at all levels, and demonstrated leadership effectiveness that far exceeded anything he had achieved with his previous approach. More importantly, he had discovered that leading through respect and collaboration was not only more effective than leading through intimidation, but also more personally fulfilling and professionally sustainable. When Marcus returned to Admiral Chun for his final debrief, he carried with him not just evidence of successful protocol implementation, but confidence that his transformation as a leader was genuine and permanent. "Captain Reed," Admiral Chun said as they reviewed the reports from his 3 assignments, "these results exceed my most optimistic expectations. But I'm more interested in your assessment of what this experience has meant for your development as an officer." Marcus considered his response carefully, wanting to capture not just what he had accomplished, but what he had learned about himself and about leadership. "Admiral Chun, 6 months ago, I thought I understood what it meant to be a military leader. I believed that authority came from rank and that effectiveness came from control. This assignment has taught me that real leadership comes from earning respect through competence and integrity, and that the most effective organizations are those where people are empowered to contribute their best efforts rather than simply comply with orders." Admiral Chin smiled, and Marcus could see satisfaction and perhaps even pride in her expression. "Captain Reed, your promotion to commander has been approved, effective immediately. But more importantly, I'm recommending you for assignment as my deputy in developing these protocols for Navy-wide implementation." The promotion was gratifying, but the assignment opportunity was truly exciting. Marcus would be continuing to work with Admiral Chun, helping to transform not just his own approach to leadership, but the culture of the entire Navy. As Marcus left Admiral Chin's office that afternoon, he reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought him to this point. 6 months earlier, he had been facing the end of his career, destroyed by his own poor judgment and unconscious biases. Now he was beginning a new chapter as a leader who understood that the most powerful military organizations were those that combined discipline with respect, security with dignity, and authority with wisdom. The incident that had nearly ended his career had instead become the beginning of his transformation into the kind of officer the Navy needed for the challenges of the future. Most importantly, Marcus had learned that true strength came not from dominating others, but from empowering them to achieve excellence. It was a lesson that would guide his leadership for the rest of his career and ensure that his encounter with Admiral Chun would continue to benefit the Navy for years to come.